Wakery and Morgan spread over the surrounding countryside, inundating thousands of acres of valuable land and threatened whole townships.
Even today, South Australia records the flood of 1956 as the state's greatest natural catastrophe. The state depends on the river for drinking water in dry years, delivered through pipelines to Adelaide and the north of the state. If pumping stations were knocked out, industry would grind to a halt at the iron city of Whyalla. Its flood peak was 12.3 metres at Morgan. It breached all man-made levees and wiped out major winery and citrus production regions for years.
I was an Adelaide journalist. When I arrived, there was a great stretch of water in the whole valley. There were various plans to evacuate people, but it was a constant state of tension and alert. The remorseless Murray crept up the main street of Mannum to unimaginable heights. The river drove up drain pipes and exploded in geysers in streets. It was night that everybody dreaded, because the river would start to infiltrate. Some of the outer banks went, others nearly went, but were saved by the crash crew. They were the commando force, ready to be rushed to anywhere the bank had weakened and was ready to break. The river was sly and treacherous. I knew as the days passed and the river peaked and the fight was won that I had been covering an epic of human endeavour, one I never forgot.
Crossing the river with the ferry was very hazardous because of the debris. Tree trunks, branches, boats, shacks, water tanks, petrol drums, anything. I had to stay operating so that motorists were able to get back to Cadell. The water was lapping the causeway by the time the last vehicle crossed. Then I was provided with a launch for future crossings. The Wakery bank manager made the crossing once a week with his cash strongbox and his pistol, which he stuck to like glue. On Sundays, up to 5 denominations of priests and ministers had to make the crossing. Luckily, they agreed to cross together, which assured me of my entry into heaven if the worst should happen. The river eventually peaked at 31 feet at Cadell, and the ferry was out of commission for 3 months.
Renmark was a remarkable island in the floodwaters, held together by an army of volunteers.
We heard all the water from the Murrumbidgee, the Darling, and the Murray was joining in one hit. We were in for a granddaddy of a flood. As a citrus grower, life just stopped in that interim period of 3 months. In the end, we worked on 20 k's of flood bank surrounding Renmark and the settlement to protect it. Without the banks, Renmark would have washed downstream. No floodlights, no lights. It was winter. It was pitch black.
Peak flow was 341,300 megalitres per day in mid-August 1956. This was sufficient to fill Adelaide's Mount Bold Reservoir 7 times each day. Total flow to South Australia for 1956-57 was 48,225,000 megalitres, enough to supply Adelaide for 250 years at the rate of consumption in 1956. Leaving the low clay and sandy flats awash, the Murray entered limestone regions where the ancient river had cut deep through rock to form sheer cliffs. There was only one way for the water to go: upwards. Towns considered safe from the waters were now victim to the unexpected.
I was 9 years old. When the water started rising, all our household furniture and goods were placed on planks supported by 44-gallon drums. The floodwaters rose to the roof of our house, but my aunt and uncle's new house collapsed from the force of the waves, which undermined the walls, and the timber and roof washed away in the floodwaters. These days, I'm an accountant, and I must have shown some aptitude in those early days, because when the tourists came, I charged them 2 shillings each to row them down the main street of Mannum in one of my father's boats.
My neighbour, who was the baker in Mannum during that time, often told his story. The local fire chief had come into the bakery and had said, "There's been a break in the levee," and so he slipped on his knee boots, took 2 steps down and found he was well up past his knees in floodwaters. They had had yeast and dough all on trays as they were making buns. They just had to empty everything else out and let it float off in the water. I do recall him saying that the bottom hotel had about 8 feet of water through it, but the pub was operational. They would row their boat up to the top balcony, where they had a hole cut in the railing, and tie up their boat.
The early high bravado of battle on the levees and community one-for-all spirit was coming to an end.
After the flood subsided, there was very little government assistance. People that had been on the floodplain at Marook, at the packing shed, were battling for some relief to rebuild. That's when everything got political. Who got what? Who got compensated? Who was in the paper? Who wasn't in the paper? All those things started to come out of the woodwork when people have had a chance to sit back and breathe and toss it all over. There was bitterness in every town over who did what and that sort of thing. For a time, I think the 1956 flood built up community spirit.
Even the enormous Lower Murray Lakes, Alexandrina and Albert, rose by almost a metre, and in the flat grazing lands to the east, water infiltrated up to 40 kilometres inland, cutting major roads to Melbourne. The complex barrage system designed to back up the massive water storage for navigation were useless as the water stirred towards the sea. Meeting it head-on was the tidal surge of the Southern Ocean. Along the battered river's edge, recovery was slow. Houses and businesses were still in ruin, and small communities suffered from the inevitable stress of loss of property, stock and cash. Incredibly, the death toll was said to be 4 lives. No one will ever know the full community cost, the early demise from tragic loss, the mental strain on families. But for wide-eyed youngsters sharing the adventure of driving a Fergie tractor, toiling with adults, it was a badge of courage, a rite of passage that helped make a stronger person. Many became the future of the river, with the gritty character to face the challenges of a river under stress from man-made disasters with far more long-term impact than a 1 in 100-year flood.